Okay, we're live.
Great. All right, at 6:02 p.m., this meeting of the Mountain View Island School Board will now be called to order. We will start with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. We will now take a roll call of trustees.
Ellen Wheeler.
Laura Blakely.
Chris Chang.
Oh, we need to unmute Trustee Berman.
Laura Berman.
Devin Conley. Let the record reflect that all 5 trustees are present. Thank you everyone for coming to this special meeting today. Next is item C, the approval of our agenda.
Staff.
Yeah,
I was just going to ask staff is going to ask that we alter, we flip item 3C and item 3A so that it goes CBA as opposed to ABC.
So moved that we second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? On a motion made by Trustee Wheeler and seconded by Trustee Blakely, the board votes unanimously to approve the revised agenda with items 3C and A being flipped so that we will go CBA. We will now move on to review and action. We will start with what was item C, the remote independent study for 2021-2022 with Tara Vickward, our Chief Human Relations Officer.
Good evening, and thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen here with you. All right, thank you. So, of course, all presentations, all the work that we do really is guided around our strategic plan, particularly around student achievement and creating high quality learning environments for our students. And so this evening, I would like to start by taking you back to the learning options presentation we had in April, just for a little bit of context. When we talked in April and May, we talked about being able to provide high quality programs for students and provide options for families. Those who wanted to come in person and those who still needed an option for distance learning. I'm not sure why I can't move. There we go. And so some of the things that we had to consider back in the spring were, really thinking about maintaining our staffing ratios. And we really wanted to eliminate combination classes because we knew that there would be some learning gaps that we would need to work with. We also wanted to make sure that we were maintaining consistency with public health protocols as we thought about our options coming into this year. And of course, maintain fiscal prudence. And so if you remember, we talked about enrollment projections. After we talked about enrollment, the number of people wanting to come back in March, we resurveyed folks to think about how many people wanted to come back to in-person learning for the 21-22 school year. And so as we resurveyed, we had about 149 students who were looking for a distance option. As we broke that down a little bit further, we knew that the numbers were really very small when we looked at each of the different grade levels. Looking even further, when we looked at middle school, the numbers of students in the different math pathways was even smaller. And so, it provides for some challenges when we were looking at an actual distance learning virtual school. And so as we looked at our options for that distance learning school, some of our things that we wanted to really make sure and consider were providing, Chromebooks for instructional use for our students, making sure that our kids had access to live instruction and similar curriculum and content to what everybody else was having. Wanted to make sure that students were getting PE and elective choices too. And so these were some of the important aspects that we talked about in the spring. When we returned for the second meeting of these learning options in May, There were some parameters discussed. We wanted to make sure that we were not doing hybrid instruction, that our kids were really getting solid instruction. We wanted to make sure we didn't have combo classes, which is really hard when our numbers are very small in those classrooms. And we wanted to have some choices, if you recall, about when students could come back into the classroom and thinking about how that would impact staffing. We had some conversations about returning to campus. And while there were, a considerable number of students that wanted distance learning, when we initially talked about this, as we said, most of our families, only 149 wanted to keep going with that distance learning, and 82 of those families only wanted in the distance learning until their children were able to be vaccinated. And so, the realization, of course, was that it was just not going to be really functional to provide all of those choices in a full virtual school. In addition to that, you might recall too that the governor at that time came out and said, no more virtual school. We really want all children to be in person. And so, of course, for all of these reasons, the state guidance, the limited enrollment, the challenges with staffing, and really, the financial ability to staff a whole school, we decided not to open that virtual school. And we were moving forward. And then just a couple of weeks ago, we got some new state guidance. And so on July 9th, AB 130 was approved. The trailer bill covered a variety of topics, including new requirements for independent study. And so short-term independent study has been adjusted. It used to be that a parent could request independent study if they were going to be gone for at least 5 days. That has now been reduced to 3. And so we can offer short-term independent study options for families who are going to be gone for 3 to 15 days. But what's really new is the long-term independent study option for the 21-22 school year. So all districts are required to offer an independent study option for families who think that their children's health could be at risk if they're returning to in-person learning. And that is determined by the parent, not necessarily by the doctor. And this long-term independent study has some specific requirements. Families need to be notified of the offerings, and we have posted information about that. Participation has to be voluntary, so parents will opt into the independent study program. And then we do have to document participation and engagement for all students who participate in that independent study program. We do have to have agreements that are signed with any family going into independent study. And students who want to return to in-person learning may do so at any time, and we will need to re-enroll them within 5 days of their request to return. And so enrollment in our neighborhood schools, of course, fluctuates a little bit throughout the year. And so students wishing to return to in-person learning may be placed back at their neighborhood school if there's still space available. But if there isn't space available at their neighborhood school, we would re-enroll at another school within the district that has available space for students at that grade level. Returning to an in-person school is important. We just need to make sure that we re-enroll it at a school that has a spot. Of course, enrollment at choice schools doesn't fluctuate quite so much. And so students returning may be placed back into the choice school or at a site with available space. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. The requirements of AB 130 are that students in grades TK to 3 would have daily synchronous time for students. There's not a time limit for how much time that is, but that it would happen daily, that students would be engaged in synchronous instruction. Students in grades 4 through 8 would include both daily live and weekly synchronous instruction. The content would be aligned to grade level standards, and instruction needs to be really equivalent to in-person instruction. So we're covering the same standards, we're offering the same number of courses throughout the year. And AB 130 does require that any special needs student cannot participate unless the IEP allows for such participation. And so we want to be really careful with our students with special needs that we are really thinking through the support process for all of those students and not just putting them in a program without, really thinking through that process together. Other requirements, the attendance for the independent study would be very similar to our distance learning attendance from last year. So there is a daily attendance monitoring that requires engagement and assignment completion. And so we do have to be able to document and verify all the completion of those assignments. We also have to continue the re-engagement plans for students who are absent for 60% of the school time. And of course, the board policy for independent study needs to be approved prior to the first day of school, which is why we're here with you today. We do have to keep written or documentation in our computers of the number of students participating in independent study. And then also how we're meeting those instructional minutes and time for each of our children enrolled. And so with all these new wonderful rules and expectations, we had to start really looking at some options. And so we've looked at 5 different options for how we can proceed with independent study for the upcoming year. And I'm not going to go through all of these right now because I'm going to share a slide on each of these 5 options with you. Option 1 was to apply for a waiver from the county to just say, we just really can't do independent study this year. Waivers can be granted for districts who have an unreasonable fiscal burden by providing independent study, or that we would not be able to provide opportunities through transfers or contracting out with somebody else. So that's option 1. Option 2 would be to provide our own remote independent study program. And, all of those requirements, I just want to say that, for the reasons we shared at the beginning, the reasons we weren't able to open our virtual school last year, this is really a challenging option, especially to think about staffing and to think about the fluctuation of students who could be moving in and out of a classroom. It would be really a challenge for our staff and our teachers to provide not only the online curriculum, but then the instructional components of that too, for a variety of grade levels. Option 3 is to contract with the County Office of Education to provide an independent study program. And these are all options that are provided within AB 130. Our county office does not currently have a K-5 program, and their space is very limited in their 6-8 program as well. So that's a challenging option for us too. Option 4 is to enter into an inter-district transfer agreement with another district offering independent study. And so we did do a lot of checking around to see what other districts were doing. The challenge with this is it is an extremely significant cost to do an inter-district transfer with somebody else. And students would have to disenroll from us. And then they would have to go through the entire re-enrollment process to come back to our district when they want to come back to in-person learning. And so, of course, it's challenging on many different avenues. And then option 5 is to contract with an outside company to provide the programming. And so contracting with an online company is much more financially feasible than the transfers. And, some of the districts, most of the districts are using an outside company for the curriculum. The programs are really well established, so it's not a reinvention of material. There are programs that have been doing online learning for quite some time. It allows us the opportunity to offer similar grade level program offerings. We would be able to offer electives to students, offer some variety of things, offer some PE or some art or different opportunities that we wouldn't probably be able to provide if we tried to staff it ourselves with our low numbers. Using a contracting company doesn't impact our in-person staffing numbers. We need to really maintain and hold those spots for kids who want to return back to in-person learning. And so we want to try not to disrupt any of our current staffing. And then the programs are really rich in data, providing a lot of detail for us regarding student attendance and engagement and assignment completion. And so with all of that, our recommendation is truly to go with option 5 and contract with a company. We have investigated a few different companies and are proposing that we contract with Edgenuity. It is an online independent study program for students. There are teachers, they are California credentialed teachers that would be provided through the contract with this company. And so their teachers would be the teacher of record who provide that interaction and instruction with our students and have the curriculum completely provided and aligned. And then we would work very closely with them to monitor our student work. Workbooks would be provided for all of our elementary students. Middle school curriculum is fully online, but the elementary curriculum, knowing that kids need to interact and engage in different ways, would provide for that physical material for every child who enrolls. And then, as I said, the progress monitoring data is really very nice and available to us so that we can still keep track of our kids who are in independent study and really monitor and see how they're doing and how they're progressing and step into support with re-engagement if need be. So as we continue the idea of contracting with Edgenuity, we can enroll our students in courses similar to our in-person. For instance, we could provide 8 courses in middle school to match the eight courses students get at our middle schools. And so they would be able to have their core classes and their electives, providing for that similar experience for everybody. And so the cost of this is, of course, there's a staff training fee to help us get everything onboarded. And then the fees per student per semester. If we don't utilize all of the spots that we would contract with, we can roll those over to the next semester. And so there is some flexibility in that and some kind of nice options for us. But these fees are all inclusive. They include the teacher time, the curriculum, the materials, and then we, of course, would provide the Chromebook for all of our students so they can access all of the information. So as we think about planning, we need to provide information to our interested families. So after we hear from you tonight about the direction you want to take, we'll hold a session for our families on Friday so that we can provide all kinds of information to our families about what independent study looks like in the process for actually applying and enrolling. We would meet with the families who are registering and review and sign all of those master agreements and make sure that everybody's aware of what the process is in independent study. We would provide devices to all of our students, make sure that they have all the materials they need, including those workbooks for our elementary students. And then we would train a staff member or staff members to monitor the attendance and engagement data so that, like I said, we can support and re-engage any students who are struggling to keep up with the independent study. And I do want to say that I need to be really clear that this is truly independent study with some instruction from a teacher. It is not the same as the virtual school that we had last year. So it's not all day teaching like we did. It is truly an independent study program with the additional support of a teacher who is checking in. And so we want to make sure that we are keeping track of kids and that we are monitoring and we are providing that support as kids need that along the way. And so this evening, you're here for guidance from you too. Number one, I need to understand, does the board have an interest in maintaining enrollment spots at choice schools for independent students to return this year or next year? If so, we would need to freeze our enrollment at the choice schools. Typically, if we have a student who leaves the choice program, we would fill their spot with someone on a waiting list. If we were to do that, it would make it very difficult for a child to return to in-person learning, come back from independent study. And so we need some guidance from you about how we want to move forward with our choice programs. And then next steps, tonight we will be asking you to approve the remote independent study board policy and ARs. And I know Dr. Rudolph said we don't usually bring an AR to you. There are just so many fine-tuned details of the AB 130 law included. And then we would hold our informational session on Friday, as I said, at 1:30. The session will be recorded so that anybody who's not able to attend will then be able to log in and watch the session and get the information that they need, even if they're not able to be there on the 6th. After attending the informational session, independent study enrollment would begin from that point. Interested students and families would complete the remote independent study request form and then attend that virtual session for information. And then families still wanting to enroll would complete the enrollment form and schedule a meeting so that we can really review together and sign those master agreements. Students will have to maintain their residency within our district boundaries to be enrolled in that remote independent study program. And so tonight, as part of this presentation, attached in your board documentation is the actual contract with Edgenuity as well, for your review and approval this evening, should that option be the direction the board wants to take.
Thank you, Ms. Vicure. I'll wait for you to take the presentation down. And are there questions from trustees? Trustee Chang.
Thank you. President Connolly, if we have a few questions, should we just?
Let's go with. Can you do a couple and then give other people a chance, and then we'll come
Yes,
back.
I can happily do that.
May have the same ones.
Thank you, President Connolly, and thank you for your presentation. First question is, if quite a few students end up enrolling in this, let's say we go with the Edgenuity contract, the Mountain View Wisman teachers who then would have been teaching those students otherwise, do we have a plan for what happens with those teachers who may, for a short period of time or even for a whole semester, not have kids?
I don't anticipate that an entire class would move into independent study. And because we do have that requirement that we would allow students, that we need to allow students to come back within 5 days, we really want to hold on to those teachers in those classroom spots and make sure we have a place for our students to return when they're ready without interrupting teachers and students and families as we make those movements between programs.
Thank you. And, students who are doing if they choose to do the remote program, during that time, will they still have access to school site counselors if they need to see, and any kind of like social emotional or community building experiences? Like, will sites kind of have the options to like virtually kind of have kids join in on certain ritualistic activities that happen on school sites?
That is a question that I need to investigate a little bit and come back to. I know that there are social emotional components of the online Edgenuity program. And as students are enrolling in independent study, they're essentially disenrolling from their class, but it is absolutely something to consider.
Thank you. I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Trustee Berman and then Trustee Blakely.
Thank you for the presentation. I was wondering about when students want to re-enroll back at their school site, how likely is it? I know the enrollment is different from school to school. How likely is it, do you think, that a child would be able to have their spot back in a neighborhood school? Do we have schools that are more impacted by enrollment than others? And I know that we don't want to guarantee families because we're not ever really sure. But do we know or have sort of an instinct of how likely that would be, or what the likelihood would be of that happening, that their child would end up in a different school?
It's a terribly hard question to answer because I don't want to make promises, like you said, and say, sure, it's 99% sure. It really depends on what enrollment looks like throughout the year and if other students are enrolling after children decide to take that independent study route. Best case, sure. We're holding on to our teachers. We're holding on to spots for enrollment. Should other people move into the area though and have those spots, that's when we would have to look at enrolling a child at the next closest school that has an open available space.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Vice President Blickley.
I think this is following up on the prior trustees' questions, but so let's say you have a second grade classroom at Landals, I'm just making this up, staffed, ordinarily it would be 25-to-1 ratio. And let's say 5 kids want to go, I assume you balance, like the classes, like all the second grade classes would have roughly the same, but essentially we'd end up with a somewhat lower teacher to student ratio, or is it the flip student to teacher ratio for the time that those students remained distant? Is that
Correct.
okay? That may not be a bad thing, as we're dealing with different people, different students coming back at different levels and all. And then I also just wanted to ask a little bit more about how Edgenuity was selected. I know there's several other programs out there.
Right. So I did meet Kathy Bauer, and I met with a few people, and I met with a couple of other companies too. And so it was really a process of, really understanding their process, their curriculum, their offerings, and how they are in compliance with AB 130, how they're meeting the requirements of that asynchronous and synchronous instruction, live instruction, and really selecting the program that we believe is going to best suit our students.
Okay, and that was where you landed, that Edgenuity is the best choice.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Trustee Wheeler.
Yeah, so it sounds like we're all thinking around the same types of issues. If some grade levels have a lot fewer students, or some schools have a lot fewer students, have you talked with the teachers or the teachers union about how they would feel about some teachers being expected to teach classes with much higher classroom load than others?
So I did speak with our union president about, the new independent study options and about, different options of contracting. And I think part of our struggle always is some schools are more impacted than others. And so we will, maintain, our ratios with the CBA and not go over and above, the numbers of students, but we'll do our best to balance, but, knowing that we need to give families the option to take the independent study and to return from independent study too. We'll do our best to balance, we'll do our best to make things right, but we know that in some circumstances, even in a regular year, some schools have lower enrollment than others. And so we will work together to stay within our contract limits of student and teacher ratios. It is the unknown right now of how many students will be in the classroom and how many will be in independent study.
Trustee Chang.
Just one last question about will the parents be surveyed, for those who know they want to do this at the beginning of the year, will they be surveyed before we do our rosters for our elementary school classrooms so that schools may be able to anticipate if one teacher ends up having a lot less kids right from the get-go from another teacher, and then that could be balanced out before the school year starts?
I don't think that we will be surveying. What we will be doing, we already do have a form for families who are interested. And so we are already monitoring and keeping track of families who are interested. And then of course on Friday when we have our information session, we will be able to really kind of see how many students and where those students are coming from. But we don't want to re-roster everybody, because we want to make sure that we have those spots for kids to come back, right? Because it may happen that somebody says, this isn't really the choice for me. I'd really rather come back to in-person learning. And so we want to be careful to be thoughtful of all of those pieces too.
I had a question about the returning to schools, neighborhood schools and choice schools. And I'm kind of running into a mental dilemma here, which is that for our neighborhood schools, we don't have control over enrollment in the sense that somebody who moves into the neighborhood, we're going to try and offer them a place at their neighborhood school is our policy. And if that's not available, well, then we figure it out. But our goal is neighborhood schools as a district, versus at the choice schools. If we allowed them right to return and froze enrollment, they would absolutely have the right to come back to the same placement, whereas the neighborhood schools would not have the right to come back to the same placement. What do we know what other districts are doing around this issue? Because it can't be unique to us. And also, you know, at the choice schools, I anticipate that at Stevenson, there's a much longer wait list than at Mistral, and that the wait list is possibly at multiple grade levels because they accept students at all grade levels. So if we said we weren't holding spaces, if parents chose to have their kids at home, does that mean we would automatically start going through the wait list and bringing kids in to replace those students?
That's really the guidance that we're looking for. Because if we accept other students on the wait list, and we say, no, sorry, if you go to independent study, you lose your spot, we would be able to fill those spots pretty quickly. And then of course that impacts the following year too, because then we would have more than a class, you know, worth of enrolled students for the outgoing year as well. And so it really is, this really is why we're looking for guidance here about what your preference is for choice schools, whether we can freeze those enrollments or not. And it is a tough decision.
And the other question I had was, at Mistral, it's rare that there are children that transfer in first grade or above in Mistral because of the Spanish language requirement. If the enrollments were frozen, but there was still classroom space in that, let's say a class is under enrolled at 20 students, for example, would we still accept people to fill up to that cap of the ratios that we have with the union?
At Mistral?
At Mistral.
For under enrolled grade levels, we do have a process for anybody in second grade or above, you know, to go through a process to make sure that they, you know, have some of the language skills to be able to jump into a dual immersion program. But we can enroll students, you know, in the Mistral program, provided that we go through that process, as long as we don't exceed the cap.
And Vice President Blakely, I saw your hand was up.
Thank you. I was thinking about this only in context of the distance learning program, but if we were to provide guidance that we would want to freeze or hold the places at the choice schools for those that enroll in our district learning distance learning program, that doesn't necessarily apply to people who pull out in homeschool, correct?
Correct. If they disenrolled completely, withdrew their children to homeschool, that would be different than taking that step out to, could be, depending on your guidance, could be different than those who choose the independent study program and want to re-enroll in person, come out of independent study and go back to in-person. They're still technically enrolled
Right.
within our district.
I definitely see a distinction. I just wanted to ask about that. Thank you.
If there are no further questions from trustees, we will now move on to public comment from this item. If you're a member of the public and you would like to comment, you can raise your hand in Zoom, or you can press *9 on your phone to raise your hand. All right, we appear to have one speaker. Kathy Schecht, you will have 3 minutes to address the board. Give us a moment to get your timer up, and we do actually ask that you keep your video off. All right, you have 3 minutes. You may unmute yourself.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so it's not Kathy, it's Alvaro. I wanted to show a little bit of our surprise with the way that this is happening in light of the current Delta variant. The case numbers right now are similar to last summer when we decided that we were not going to go back in person. They're actually growing faster. The population at this point that is vulnerable, although of course the hospitalizations now are very different because they're children, but essentially right now what's left that is vulnerable is children and unvaccinated. And you can only expect that the virus is going to mutate in the direction of the population that is unprotected at this point. So even though I think it's great that we're opening our schools, that we're providing that option at this point for those of us that are hesitant because we've been doing this so long. This seems like the district, it feels like our hands are being forced by not guaranteeing our spot. We are committed to our neighborhood school, but the thought that because we're going to wait for a couple of months until the vaccination is available for children, we're going to end up in a different school. So that's going to cause one more, the rest of the year is going to be churn. And then next year, I suppose we might try and go back to our neighborhood school, and that would be another source of churn. It feels like, it's kind of a big deal. And especially since we've been doing this for 1.5 years. So of course, there's plenty of things I don't know, but I really wonder why can't the spots be saved as if the kids were there? The organization of the year can proceed. It's just that for a couple of months until the vaccines are available for children, and it sounds like they're going to be available very soon, the spot would be saved. And there could be a guidance that as soon as the vaccine is available, 15 days later, then we can change the policies back to what you're describing right now. But in the meantime, it feels a little unfair, a little pushy. And especially, when you can feel some of this because you are considering the choice schools, providing a different policy for the choice schools. And I say, well, my spot for my kid in my neighborhood school is just as important as the spot in a choice school, because we want to be in a school where my kid will be there for the years to come, close to home. So as usual, appreciating all the work that goes into this, but I would urge a little bit of flexibility and understanding that we're almost there. And the situation right now is turning dire by the day. Thank you.
Thank you. Comments from trustees? Trustee Chang.
Thank you, President Connolly. I fully support the district's recommendation. On the question of spots for choice schools or any school, I would recommend our colleagues guarantee all spots for this year, certainly next year, but also for this year in that sense that regardless of the logistical hardships that causes, we've already gotten a sense in the emails to the board that that while most families would have practically received their spot back at their school, this is the thought that they might lose their spot, especially for choice parents, but all parents, has created a sense of anxiety. And in this pandemic, and as we are entering this new phase, I think anything we can do to reduce the edge for parents, even if it means some financial or logistical hardships, I think it's an easy one for us just to say, you know what, if you decide you need to do this for whatever number of period of time, let's hold your spot. I just think it just seems like a way to make lives easier for parents. The only other thing I would just want to urge is that, in addition to recommending that we support this, recommending that if it hits a certain size, that this come back to the board. So if over, like, let's say, and welcome hearing from our colleagues here, but let's say 20% of our district is on an Edgenuity contract. You know, it's over 1,000 students, over $1 million contract. There has to be some threshold where we visit this because the nature of it changes when we hit a certain percentile. So those are my only two comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Chang. Other comments, Trustee Wheeler?
Yeah, so, and I'm sorry, I didn't get the name of the community commenter. Can you?
It was Alvaro. I apologize, Alvaro. I don't remember your last name. I can look it up though.
Okay, anyway, the community commenter was expressing thoughts that are similar to mine. So I think the thing that is out there that everyone is paying attention to is, you know, the kind of this shining star and the, you know, it's coming up soon, is that vaccinations for young children are predicted to be available in October or so, which, you know, and we're hearing from parents say, you know, can we at least stay out until my child can get vaccinated? So my thought is, you know, and, you know, there's no guarantee that, you know, a vaccination will be available in October, but I think that's a, you know, fairly reasonable guidepost. And what that is similar to is trimester markings. So what I'm thinking is, you know, we could hold spots for people, allow them, you know, for the first trimester, and allow them to see how the independent study program is working for their child, give them a chance to get their child vaccinated. If they're able to get vaccinated and they want to come back, then they've got a space to come back to. And Trustee Chang, I don't see holding spots for an entire year. I think that's just unworkable and unrealistic. I have a lot of empathy for, you know, the parents who, you know, whether you're a neighborhood or you're a choice parent, you want to go to the school, you want your child to go to the school that you envisioned for them. So, but I can't see holding out for a year. I could see, you know, usually I'm kind of a, you know, black and white decision maker, but instead of saying, you know, you have to make your decision right now and it's, you know, good for the whole year, because this vaccination is predicted to be out there in October. I would recommend allowing people to wait a while and then, you know, make their decision. Hopefully, you know, encourage all those parents to get their kids vaccinated as soon as they can. And I agree with Trustee Chang about, you know, we should revisit this. You know, if the interested parent numbers get a lot higher, then, you know, we would need to see, you know, what we want to do as a district. And I imagine Ms. Bickard is, you know, thinking the same thing, that, you know, if we get 20% of our parents saying they, you know, don't feel safe sending their children to school, would we want to continue with this this contract, or would we want to, go back to, what we did last year? None of these are ideal, but we're not in ideal circumstances. But yes, I agree. One of the big questions is, do you agree with, agree with this contract? And I would say, yes, I agree with the contract.
Hey, may I jump in?
Yeah.
Really quick? Thank you so much. I want to give a couple of quick reminders. One, we can't really go back to what we did last year unless we're given that guidance from the state. Right now, we're in person, and independent study is our option. And so we would have to wait for state guidance to make that change. The other thing is, I want to just keep reminding and be clear that when families go to independent study, they're technically not enrolled in their neighborhood school. They don't have a teacher assigned to them. They would be literally enrolling in independent study. And so, and as we think about spots back, it's not that you have a spot in a teacher's classroom. And I want to be careful that we are clear about, the distinction between the two, that we are truly disenrolling and enrolling in independent study. I'm not totally sure that vaccines are going to be there, when they're going to be there. It might be lovely if it's October, it could be December. So, I just want to be thoughtful and clear that there's a reason that the state has said, return from independent study needs to be back in the district, but not at your home school, because I think the state too understands the implications that we have to be careful of making sure we have a space for you to come back for sure, but not, not impacting our neighborhoods and having some flexibility that we take care of everybody without impacting our classes.
And just to add one more point, what the request is that you're freezing enrollment at choice schools. You're not holding a spot. Whereas at neighborhood schools, enrollment is always fluctuating and is always moving. The difference here is that you're capping choice schools where they are and not allowing anyone else the opportunity to enroll in them in order to the possibility of preserving a space. There's a distinct difference between the two. One is a cap, the other one is a true holding space, which you can't do because CalPAS will not allow you to hold two kids into two different systems for reporting purposes.
Vice President Blakely.
So in terms of capping enrollment at the choice schools, if a family notified us that they were moving to Alaska or Florida or Missouri or anywhere else, those spots would become available, would they not? Because they're not just, you're only sort of holding spots for the ones that enroll in the distance program. Okay. Well, I tend to agree with what everybody else is saying. I would have a strong preference to the extent possible and feasible to preserve spots for neighborhood students as well. All the data that I've been hearing is saying December. I did hear that Pfizer is working on the dosing, but everything I've read is saying December. So that's halfway through the year. And I would love it to be tomorrow. I'm sure we all feel the same way, but I think we have to be realistic as well. So I'm comfortable not having the impact of students at Mistral or Stevenson whose families decide to enroll in the distance learning program to kind of retain their spots. I'm comfortable with that. If it's possible to do the same for the neighborhood schools, it sounds like Dr. Rudolph and you were saying it isn't, but just keeping an eye on things. I would rather if a new family moves into the BUB zone and BUB was really full, maybe you put them at Mauna Loma or at Therakoff or at Landals.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate our intent is that we do everything we can to place someone at the neighborhood school. However, you have to remember that it's a as soon as a parent says, I don't want to be an independent study, they can leave and, they can exit and they have to be placed back within 5 days. And so you're constantly fluctuating. So I'll use a school like Montaloma as a good example. Montaloma, normally after Labor Day, is when most of the military orders start coming in and you start seeing the most movement. And then traditionally in our school year, you start to see an increase of enrollment all the way up until right around February. And then it sort of taps off around March, and then it sort of stays where it is. So our enrollment always swells the further the year goes. And so in this case, it's not that we wouldn't try, because we're keeping our staffing ratio the exact same. So in theory, you have enough seats for everyone. But if a school experiences an influx of individuals and you have people who are gone, we won't have the capacity to add additional teachers as the year goes on. And so while we will do everything we can to place a kid at their neighborhood school, we do have the realistic idea. You have to understand that at some point, you may have to go to another school until the end of the year. And that's just the reality of this. Whereas at the choice schools, if you allow that to happen, there is no going back. And I think that's where the difference is, why there's a request to cap the enrollment, because once we allow someone to go into Mistral, that spot is gone until the kid leaves. And I know it's nuanced, right? Because it's like, in theory, it's the exact same thing. The difference though is that, you know, we do everything within our power to assure that people get into the neighborhood schools. We keep the choice schools at a very fixed number of spaces intentionally, so that they don't, and so that kids can stay in their school. So it's, you know, I don't want people to think like it's possible that you won't be at your school, but it is one of the consequences of this, that you just need to know that it's possible. But because we're not losing teachers, we're not, you know, like if we lose 100 people at Bub, we're not going to cut by 5 teachers. We're going to keep those 5 teachers there. So again, it is extremely likely that the space is there. But worst case scenario, you just need to know it may not happen, and we may have to move you to another school for the remainder of the year.
Thank you. And I do want to make sure that I'm supportive of holding the slots then at the choice programs, but I want to make sure that that is limited to people that enroll in the distance program and not people that entirely pull out and homeschool.
Trustee Berman.
I second what Trustee Blakely just said. I was feeling like, you know, when I think of Mistral specifically, I think about families that have committed to a language program and how challenging it is. You really depend on the progression to really acquire the language, and sort of being pulled out and not getting that spot back would really impact that language acquisition for that child long term. So it just felt like it would be really important for that child, if they're committed to the language acquisition, that they're able to get that spot back because the family has made that commitment. And that being said, if we're going to cap one choice school, we should definitely cap the other. And my thinking in sort of approving that too was that if those students are sort of guaranteed their spots in their choice schools, then when they are ready to come back, they have a school to come back to, versus maybe taking another spot in a neighborhood school that might affect someone who wants to go back to their neighborhood school. And that being said, you know, I also understand how stressful this is. I'm sure that families that are going to opt into the independent study program are doing it because out of necessity. And I know that this is an added anxiety of what will happen when their child comes back. And we want them to be back with their friends and their teachers and things that are familiar. And I'm glad to hear that we'll do everything possible to get them back into their neighborhood school. And I wish that it would be nice if there'd be a way to guarantee everyone their neighborhood school and their choice school. But I'm hearing that would be really challenging for the district to do. So if there's a way to do it, I would be in support of that, and definitely a cap for the choice schools.
All right, thank you, Trustee Berman. Trustee Chang.
I think I support everything everyone said, and especially this idea of through December of some type of kind of security for families. There was something that I thought about, wondering colleagues' thoughts about if we should support more funding for counseling and some extra supports that distance. If some of these students end up doing this for a good period of time, this will be their second half to third year they've done this, and so there's a lot of kind of SEL or just kind of mental health issues that come about with online learning for this long haul. So I think it'd be interesting to see if the district looks into, do we fund another third party, whether through Hvac or somebody else, that could provide some supports. There's been a lot of really good, effective online programs for adults on using virtual therapy these days of just doing voice check-ins and chats. That kind of interpersonal connection for our kids on a mental level, I think could be a very helpful thing to explore. Yeah. Thank you.
Trustee Berman.
I think just adding on to that, thank you, Trustee Chang, is perhaps having, I know that we'll have someone who has oversight of the independent study. So an opportunity perhaps to check in with families to see if there are mental health concerns, and maybe a description of what that could potentially look like. And then if we can sort of think about how to best match the families that need that additional support, that would be wonderful.
I will add that I anticipate that there will be demand for the independent study program, but I don't think it will equal anything like what we had for distance learning last year, because when we look at independent study, especially for the younger grades, it's K-5, it's a minimum of 1 hour of live instruction a day, and that's it. And so to have the capacity to do this with your child, you really have to have someone who is going to be engaging with that child all day long otherwise, and taking them through all of the activities and doing all of the assignments as well. So I wish that if the state was going to do this, they would have funded something much more robust. Instead, this is a mediocre solution to give parents an option, but it really gives, frankly, our most affluent and families an option, and not everyone else, because it requires so many resources to have childcare at home. And I don't think I could be wrong, but I don't think we're going to have the same uptake on this that we had on distance learning last year. That being said, when we look at our school enrollment for our neighborhood schools, Ms. Bickyard, my assumption, because we had lower enrollment by the end of the school year last year, is that our schools are not at their capacity right now with the enrollment we're going into in the fall, especially because we're not having any combo classes.
That is true. We are still lower enrollment wise than we were a couple of years ago, district wide.
Yeah, so I think I wish we could give everyone the security of knowing exactly what spot they would land in if they do independent study and come back. I understand infeasibility of that district-wide across all of the neighborhoods. And so, but I do believe that there is a very, very, very high likelihood that if somebody chooses to do independent study, when they return to their neighborhood school, they will be able to return. We can't make a guarantee, and I think that's the scary part, but I think it is highly, highly likely. It sounds like from hearing trustees that we have 3 trustees, including myself, who feel that the neighborhood schools, we can't freeze that enrollment. And I do think we should cap the enrollment at the choice schools, in part because that will keep them from impacting the neighborhood schools. I thought that was a very good point, Steve. That if we were to not guarantee those spots, then we're going to throw off our neighborhood schools even more and make it harder for children to return to their neighborhood schools. Are there further comments from trustees, or is there a motion? Because this is an action item. We need to approve the contract, and we also need to make a motion regarding whether or not to cap choice school enrollment.
I can make
Vice
a
President
motion.
Blakely.
Oh.
Oh, go ahead, Trustee Berman.
Trustee Berman, please.
Thank you. I'd like to make a motion that we approve the long-term independent study option. Is this right? Am I on the right one?
Mhm.
Yep, and the contract with Edgenuity.
Yep, that we approve the long-term independent study option and Ingenuity contract for the 2021-2022 school year as presented.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? That appear no. Any opposed?
No opposed.
saw like
I had
a
a
flicker of a
question
hand.
after this, but I
Okay,
voted for this.
okay.
Yeah.
All right. On a motion made by Trustee Berman and seconded by Vice President Blakely, the board votes unanimously to approve the independent study program as presented and the Edgenuity contract. Trustee Chang.
Yes. Do we need to do any further thing about the you were mentioning about the cap, or does it seem like the district has enough guidance from what we said already for the choice program caps?
Ms. Vickiorn.
I have been taking notes, and I do have guidance. I have notes from each of you about caps. If you'd like to make it official and take a vote, that'd be lovely. But I think we have enough guidance about what we do with our choice schools.
I'm happy to make a motion if that's helpful. I move that we approve, I'm trying to see thing, but that we approve capping enrollment in the choice schools for students whose families enroll them in the distance learning program for the 2021-22 year. Yes,
Can I just
Trustee
edit
Kelly, please.
and then to say independent study program and not distance learning because it's a
Independent
yeah.
study program.
It is
Thank
for
you.
Second.
All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? On a motion made by Trustee Blakely and seconded by Trustee Trustee Chang, the board unanimously votes to cap enrollment at choice schools for the upcoming school year for those families who attend the independent study program. All right, we will now move on to our next item. This is still item B. It is at 7:05 p.m. We will close the Mountain View Wisdom Board meeting and open a public hearing on the new Administrative Policy 6158 regarding remote independent study as required by Assembly Bill 130 with our presentation from our Chief Human Relations Officer, Tara Vickiorn.
Thank you. And I don't have an official presentation for you. I have the attached board policy for you. I do just want to share that this board policy is specifically for the 21-22 school year, only for the duration of AB 130. And it is a new board policy for the remote independent study that we've just discussed.
Thank you, Ms. Vickiorn. Are there questions from trustees? Seeing as there are none, we will move to public comment. If you're a member of the public and you would like to comment on the proposed Administrative Policy 6158, you can raise your hand in Zoom or press *9 on your phone. We do not appear to have any public comment at this time. Are there comments from trustees or a motion?
I move that the Board of Trustees approve the proposed new board policy BP 6158, remote independent study at first reading as presented.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? On a motion made by Vice President Blakely and seconded by Trustee Wheeler, the board votes unanimously to approve the new administrative policy 6158 regarding remote independent study. At 7:07 p.m., I will now close this public hearing, and we will move on to our last item, which was formerly item A, and we've moved it in our agenda. At 7:07 p.m., I will open a public hearing on the new administrative regulation 6158 regarding remote independent study as required by Assembly Bill 130. Ms. Vickyard.
Very similarly, I don't have an official presentation on this, but typically we do not bring an administrative regulation to the board. But again, these are specific details of AB 130 that are for the 21-22 school year only, that are very specific about the requirements of the independent study program presented.
Thank you. And trustees, I apologize. I kept saying administrative policy, which is not a thing. It's a board policy or an administrative regulation, but moving everything around in the agenda, I got the policy word. Are there questions from trustees? Seeing as there are none, if you're a member of the public and you would like to comment on this item, you can raise your hand in Zoom or press *9 on your phone. Seeing as there are no public comments, are there comments from trustees or a motion? Trustee Berman.
I'd like to make a motion that we approve the new administrative regulation AR 6158 remote independent study at first reading as presented.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? On a motion made by Trustee Berman and seconded by Trustee Wheeler, the board votes unanimously to approve Administrative Regulation 6158 as presented. At 7:09 p.m., we will now close this public hearing and we will reopen the board meeting of the Mountain View Wisman School District Board of Trustees. We are now on item 5A. This is safety protocols for the 2021-22 school year with a presentation from Dr. Rudolph.
Okay, here we go. And this presentation has been placed on the school district's website. It was completed today. But there are some questions that staff has that we need guidance on, and so we'll take you through. So we want to go over some of the safety measures that we have and just sort of review all of the things that we're doing, which will lead to a couple questions that are still lingering as we start planning for the start of the school year. The first one is, and I'm going to fly through these, Hvac Infiltration. All campuses that were scheduled to have their HVAC systems overhauled have been done and completed on time, as well as we have MERV 13 filters everywhere. We also have portable filters in spaces, offices, or smaller closets that don't have, that could not accommodate the MERV 13 filters. And then all campuses have been maximized for external air intake. Cleaning protocols still stay the same. We will continue to do daily cleaning. What we will not do as frequently is last year during the school year, we would do almost every hour on the hour. And what the guidance that we've gotten from the CDC, as well as the California Department of Public Health, states that the likelihood of catching COVID through touch is a lot less. And so the requirement for ongoing or constant cleaning isn't needed as much. And that will help us out because our feeding, with more kids being on campus, we'll need to spend a little bit more time in the cafeterias or in the MURs and feeding kids. So because we'll have larger numbers. There we go. Sorry, also want to talk about cleaning protocols. Physical barriers. All students have desk shields. Students are spaced 3 feet apart where possible. And the front office have barriers. There are different size barriers depending on the grade level. Elementary have smaller ones, middle school have taller ones, and we swapped all of those out. Masking. All students as well as adults are required to wear masks on campus, both indoors and outdoors. People who are exempted from wearing masks must have a non-restrictive alternative shield with a drape at the bottom edge. And one of the decisions that we strategically made, last year we cohorted kids, which meant that they could only play in certain areas or they could only be with certain kids. We really felt, the feedback we got from parents as well as others is that really limited interactions. And so we went with asking kids to mask outdoors. So that way we could allow kids to sort of interact with kids from all classes as opposed to just their friends who are in their actual classroom. Social distancing guideline, there's been a lot of changes with this. The first one to recognize is that the CDC, as well as the California Department of Public Health, they recommend maintaining at least 3 feet social distancing between students. It is CDC recommends 6 feet between adults and students. However, they do have a nuance now, which says when you're not able to maintain it, it is especially important to layer multiple prevention strategies such as indoor masking, upgrading the HVAC system. And so those items really help us. Since we're not cohorting kids in the same way we did last year, we are using the multiple mitigation approach in order to help. Transportation, there's no social distancing requirement on buses per the Santa Clara County Department of Public Health. However, we will maintain that windows are open. We're asking students to wear masks. We are going to have seating charts. And then we are exploring busing with students with disabilities as well as students from Moffett. Physical educations. So lockers, PE, masks, and social distancing is going to be required. Social distancing will take place to the extent possible. Again, masking does sort of reduce the need for distancing. Food services, we are focusing on eating outside as much as possible and using physical distance as much as possible. We also recognize that it's not going to always be possible to have every kid outside, or it won't always be possible to have every kid sort of sitting in just various ways, but we're going to do our best. We will clean, and this is part of the reason why we're not going to clean or have that sort of time that we would air out a classroom and clean it, because we're spending more time cleaning the surfaces as kids are coming through to the MERs and to make sure that we are keeping kids safe. Sports, this is a change. New this year, both schools are now in the same athletic league. And one of the changes that we've made also is that there will be screening testing, and this is also a requirement of the league, screening tests for participants, student athlete, coaches, trainers, and other peoples, as well as adult volunteers. For music and chorus, again, our recommendation is to go outside when possible. However, we are providing specialized masks for chorus, which is recommended in singing. And then we also have, for the aerosol producing instruments, they not only have bell covers for the instruments, but they also will have instrument masks, which allow them to play the instrument, but also keep, it sort of drapes over their face. So it reduces the risk. Visitor guidance. So we are going to accept COVID vaccinated adults as on-campus volunteers. There will be a pre-registration process that has to go through the school districts. Masks are required, and volunteers, as well as any of our partners and contractors, must maintain a 6 feet social distance from the actual students. And then, of course, we will constantly emphasize the importance of staying home when sick. But visitors who are unvaccinated or who have not pre-registered will not be able to walk past the front office. So now we start thinking about employee testing. So everyone in the state is offering testing at no cost to employees. It is one of our requirements. The difference, though, is that we are not doing El Camino Hospital and the healthcare district are not doing on-site testing this year, but we will have the opportunity in order to allow staff to get tested. All employees are required to submit vaccine status. And if an employee does not submit vaccine status, they are considered not vaccinated. And you will see an updated chart as of the 29th of where we are per site. And I know this is one of those areas where we've received a couple of emails about individuals who are not vaccinated. And I know ultimately there was a question from the trustees whether or not we could mandate vaccines for staff. And the answer is yes, we could mandate vaccines for staff, but there are some secondary implications that actually come. So we did consult legal on this. If you want the question about whether or not we could mandate vaccines for students, similar to what the California UC system did, the difference is that we do have to wait for a California Department of Education, California Department of Public Health to determine which vaccinations are necessary. So for unvaccinated employees, they are required to do weekly testing. They will have to follow quarantine guidelines, and they will be offered an N95 mask. We will continue to use our OK to Reopen screener daily. It goes either by phone or over email to individuals. Principals and directors will monitor staff. Secretaries will continue to monitor students. And so here's where we start to come into some questions as we start to think about student testing and sort of understand where the board sort of wants to sit with testing. And so I'm going to just talk about some of the options that we have. So obviously there are a couple of different test options. There are PCRs, there are the rapid antigen tests, and then there are pool testing results. Each one of these sort of differs depending on what your intent is. And each one requires a different amount or different workload for staff. And so one of the things we're going to be asking about is sort of what type of testing, the cadence, as well as what type of testing that you're looking for. PCR tests often have a delayed result, which means that, for someone who was asymptomatic and we did a PCR individual test, chances are they'll be out of school for a couple of days if they quarantine. Obviously, pool testing is an approach where, I guess I can just go to this, right? So pool testing, you have a group up to 25 students who are all their swabs are sort of tested, and then the pool is given a result. However, if there is someone who tests positive within that pool result, then you would go and recommend that further testing takes place. It is a faster method to sort of check whether or not we have a positive case. All testing requires parent consent for testing, and so we can't test a student without parent consent. So that's just one of the nuances that we have. But they also can provide they can provide the rapid test as well as a PCR test if that's where the board wants to go. Again, I just want to reiterate that there are costs that are associated with it. And there's also different timeframes that are associated with it. And I'm sure if when we get to that part, Tara can also jump in because she's been doing most of the work around this regard. There's been a question about how come LAUSD is able to mandate testing, whereas we haven't been. So LA Unified's county, their health order actually requires screening and on a cadence. And so their order is different than what the Santa Clara County's order is, which is why you see LA Unified actually talking about they're mandating testing before the start of the school year to establish a baseline. And so the county order is actually what drives the conversation, not the school district. Of course, some people could argue that because of the size of LA Unified, they probably have a large sway in terms of county health decisions. But at the end of the day, it's still the county health department that makes that determination. It is not the school district. But we are still looking at we still have pool testing that is available to all of our students. Again, parents would have to provide consent that they would like to do it. And I described this a little bit earlier. You know, if there is a positive result, then we would follow up with individual testing. Quarantining is really a lot more complex now because you have vaccinated and unvaccinated individuals. And so we're working with the county to get some clear spreadsheets or sort of decision matrix in terms of what happens. I don't want to dive into all the nuances because it really does boil down to not only are you vaccinated, did you wear a mask, how long you were near someone, and all these other variables, but I'll try my best to go over just a couple right here. So for non-vaccinated adults, they must quarantine. And if they haven't been fully vaccinated or they've had close contact with somebody, then if we believe that there's an exposure, they must follow the sort of the older procedures that we had previously. The difference is that the amount of time for quarantine has sort of changed. If you're unvaccinated students and exposures between both parties when they were wearing a mask, and then so the unvaccinated students who are close contacts may continue to attend schools if they, one, are asymptomatic, two, they continue to wear a mask appropriately, three, they undergo testing during the 10-day, twice weekly testing during a 10-day period, and they continue to quarantine for all extracurricular activities. And then again, unvaccinated close contacts who were not wearing masks from an individual. And so if they remain asymptomatic and they've not had symptoms, then they can discontinue self-quarantine after the following conditions are met. They can end after day 10 from the last exposure, or they end after day 7 if a diagnostic specimen was collected after day 5. And then, you know, again, you can discontinue quarantine after 14 days. The point here is that, you know, every scenario is really going to be extremely unique, and it is going to require a lot more sort of diligence from our part. We have a contract with Rural Health. And so we did talk about having Rural Health assist us with bringing a nurse on staff to sort of help with the monitoring of the vaccination status. Not sure. Okay. And so we have some direction that we are actually seeking. So the first one is we need direction from the board about field trips. Considering that the various mitigation strategies that we have in place, what considerations should we take into account when preparing for field trips? This is not a tacit agreement that we want to do field trips, but we do need to plan, or we need to make a decision about whether we are going to do field trips or we're not. So the question here is, what things do we need to take into consideration if we're doing field trips during the day? What things do we need to take into consideration if we're doing them overnight? It is important for us to get a decision on this because we have some commitments that we've entered into, and we have the ability to cancel those commitments at no cost to us. But it's really determined, especially for the overnight ones, it's determined by the board's direction about whether or not we are going to allow overnight trips or field trips during the day. The second question that we have is about testing, considering the various types of COVID tests that are available in the district's capacity to implement testing? What considerations should we keep in mind about the frequency of testing, as well as who does the board believe should be tested? And so sorry, I think I got a lag on Google here, so I'm going back and forth. Here we go. And I have shared this with you all, so you're more than welcome to pull it up. I know that I'll do the stop share because it seems to be, at least on my screen, fluctuating or lagging pretty badly.
Thank you, Dr. Rudolph. Note for trustees, if my screen goes black, it's because my internet is not great right now either, and it means I have everything in front of me is frozen, and I'll turn off my video, see if I can get a stable internet connection back, in which case Vice President Blakely will step in for me, I'm sure. Are there questions from trustees? I'm sure there are. Trustee Chang?
In looking at the testing options, has the district explored options of doing any saliva testing? I know that some independent schools do that regularly, and some public schools outside, like in Baltimore, they do weekly saliva testing. Or all testing or otherwise, is all these options on our table all nasal swab?
May I jump in and answer that? We actually are working with 2 different companies right now to talk about all of the different options that are out there on the table. The pooled testing option that was shared with you is all nasal swab. So there are, the pooled tests and the rapid antigen tests that are available from that company are the nasal swab tests. I do have some meetings with another company tomorrow to talk about different testing options, including PCR tests and a variety of testing availability. So part of the reason for looking for guidance tonight is to kind of proceed and go further with whichever company is able to offer the types of testing that we're looking for.
Thank you. Vice President Blakely had a question.
I had kind of 2 questions that are a little bit different, but one, there was that chart that had the colors that let's see, it's on page 19 of the slides. And it talked about, it was screening testing recommendations for K-12 schools by level of community transmission. And it was the blue, yellow, orange, red. And I was digging around on the county website today, trying to figure out where we were now, and I couldn't find it. Where are we now? Do we know that? Low, moderate, substantial, or high?
I can check CDC's map to see where they have us classified. Last time I checked, we were in sort of the orange, but let me go back and look just real quick.
Okay, thank you. And then the other question, which is totally unrelated, but you mentioned that to cancel field trip, especially overnight field trip, which I'm thinking maybe is not a very good idea. Do we cancel? Can we just cancel them for first semester and hold off on our first half of the year and hold off like on spring trips? I mean, the overnight ones are historically have been 5th grade and 8th grade, right? And the 8th graders theoretically could be vaccinated because they're 12 or older. So I'm just wondering if we can kind of hedge our bets, or could we, on the overnight trips, maybe just cancel them for the younger students if we couldn't hedge our bets?
So I can jump in with Nature Bridge for 8th grade. They haven't put out a schedule yet, and they're not looking to offer programs till the spring. So we really don't have a lot of information yet if we'll even be able, or students will be able to attend. Walden West for 5th grade did come out and say they were offering both a combination of schools could choose virtual or in-person overnight 4-night programs. We do have dates scheduled for all schools, but they start in October. And so we need some, it's a tough situation for our fifth graders, and but we do need some direction on whether or not we think this is the right way to go, or we need to make a decision to move to a more of a virtual option.
Okay, thank you.
And to answer your question, Trustee Blakey, it is substantial. So it's 12 per 100 with a percent of positive tests at 3%.
I mean, I'm just going to jump in and say an overnight field trip when we're at a substantial level doesn't sound remotely feasible to me or responsible on our part as a district. I know we aren't even at comments yet, but goodness, that's to do it in October. Delta is here. It hasn't entirely peaked yet. What we've seen in other countries is there's a point where it kind of fizzles out very rapidly, but we also have the Lambda variant coming, and Lambda doesn't care so much about our vaccinations so far. So as we think ahead, I would encourage all the trustees to think about not just COVID-19 as we knew it or Delta as we knew it, also anticipating Lambda coming down the line, which is really widespread and is coming our way eventually. It's just not here yet. Trustee Berman.
You can't wear masks while you're asleep.
No, no, you can't. It's true. Trustee Berman.
So back to, I would agree with that. So I'll just put that out there that it does not feel responsible for us to approve overnight field trips given the situation that we're in. It does not feel like that would be the safest thing for our community. And I have a question about pool testing. Can you just explain to me how does that, I'm not sure how it works. Does every child administer their own swab, and then each child puts it into the little tube and it gets sent out? And what's the timing on that? How quickly could we get it back? I imagine that coming back to school, we're getting kids that have been traveling and have been everywhere. And I am curious how quickly we can get our kids that are back on campus tested, and how can we test as many of them as possible? And even if it means potentially having different tests, after each break, and maybe more frequency after each break. And then once we sort of kind of figure out where we are, then maybe going to with a different type of test or a different type of cadence maybe. But especially after each break, I think there's a little bit more of a necessity to make sure everyone's healthy.
So if I could answer about the pooled testing. So the students who have, the parent permission to test, each of them would get a swab, and then they would swab and then stick their swab into the tube. All of the swabs go into the same tube, and that tube then gets tested. Typically results are coming back in about 24 hours, but of course, like all of our tests, the more people who are testing, the longer the results take to come back. As soon as results come back, if there were a positive pool, we would immediately then go to the next phase of testing, and then test again individually. We can do rapid antigen testing. Those results are done in 20 minutes. And so, there are some various options depending on the situation and the timing.
And when it sounds like we are going to seek parent permission for testing, how will parents opt in? Will there be a form that gets put out? I just want to make sure we encourage this. It's a public service, right? Like this is what's going to keep our schools open and safe. The more parents we have opting into this, the more information we have to keep our schools open. And therefore our families can go to work because they don't have to worry about childcare also. So it's really critical. So I'm just wondering if we can make sure that messaging, I think, is really important too. So just wondering what that's going to look like for parents to opt in.
Right. And I think you're exactly right on this idea that when you opt in to have your child tested, you reduce the opportunity for quarantining at home. And so there is definitely benefit in that. We have a couple of different ways for parents to sign their release. We can do it electronically, which is the preferred method. And so we can send out electronic authorization forms. People just go in on their phone or on their computer and sign those. For folks who don't have access, we also can print those forms and have people sign physically on paper. We don't want to miss anybody and their opportunity to authorize testing. So we can do both.
Ms. Fiord,
So I was just going to put one other piece. Part of the question here is also sort of what cadence and what type of testing you want, and that because that changes what type of form we have to submit out. So some are a little bit more intrusive than others, and how fast you would like the results. And so I'm sure we can mix and match, but it's just one thing for us to consider as we're thinking about. We're waiting for this meeting to give us guidance so that we know exactly which test to order, and then we can start mapping out the communication plan.
is it possible to do an opt-out instead of an opt-in regarding the testing? No, we can't.
I'm afraid
legally
not.
do that.
No, because for the testing companies to actually be able to run a test for a minor, they have to have the parental consent. And so it's an actual consent form that needs to be signed for every minor.
Can we incorporate it as part of the screener that the kids do every morning?
That they have to, that it pops up in the screener when they see it each morning, Trustee Berkeley? Another opportunity to sign up.
Let me find out.
I also noticed, so Concentric, I want to clarify for people in this discussion or in these questions. Concentric says on their website that their pool testing is a PCR test. They also offer separate rapid antigen and PCR tests, but the pool testing itself is PCR. And there have been some questions lately about whether or not a rapid antigen test, not all of them seem great at detecting the Delta variant because of some differences in the spike proteins, but I am not an epidemiologist. I would just ask that when you speak with Concentric and when you speak with whichever vendor you're speaking with tomorrow, that one of the questions we are asking is, what is the pool testing? How accurate is it regarding the Delta variant? Trustee Chang, I saw your hand up.
Thank you. So the small percentage of district staff that aren't vaccinated, they're being asked to test weekly. For the vaccinated staff, is there any interval system that's being expected for them to be tested?
If there is a risk of exposure, then we're required to do testing. You know, these are the, I guess I would say these are the minimum state guidelines. If the board decides that you would like for testing to take place on a more frequent basis, then that's also something that we need to know. Just be mindful that as per state guidance, we need to make sure that we not only offer it, but we offer people the time during the workday to actually get the test, which is why we will order those for staff.
I have a couple of questions that aren't necessarily about testing. So some of the items that we're doing around safety, we talk about maximizing things like maximizing outdoor eating, maximizing ventilation. As a parent, I want to know, and I'm like putting on my parent hat and I'm thinking about what I'm hearing from parents around me. They want to know what actually is happening in their child's classroom. Where are they eating lunch and how are they going to find that out? When will they know? I can imagine some people who, if they find out that there's a certain set of circumstances where those things can't be maximized, they may decide they want to be in the independent study program. Is that something that they can move to after school starts as well?
So the first one is, to answer your first question, it depends on the site. So each site principal, when they talk about orientation, will be discussing sort of what lunch looks like. So I'll use, Vargas as a good example. So the SAGE structure is still is moving along, but it still encompasses a large part of the yard, which means that outdoors eating capacity is very limited unless you put them on a turf. And if you know anything about turfs, right, they do heat up over time as the day goes on. You can get somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 30 degrees hotter, right, which is why they typically have sprinkler systems to sort of bring the temperature back down. So at Vargas, eating will probably look a little bit different compared to, I know it's not a fair comparison, but we'll use Graham. And Graham has, 50 lunch tables. They probably don't have 50, but they have a series of lunch tables outside. Or I can use another elementary school. We'll use Landals, which has them in between the finger wings, right? And so it will look a little bit different at Landals, which also has a lot more space than it does at Vargas. But each site is going to discuss that as they're doing sort of the welcome back things. And I know the principals are actually working on that. In terms of whether or not a parent can go in and out, in theory, yes, a parent can make a decision. What is different about AB 130 versus where we were last year, you don't have to, all you have to do is say that there's a reasonable sort of, and I hate to say fear, right? But there's a reasonable suspicion or concern that your child is going to be exposed to COVID, and that is what allows you to move into ISP, and then you can move in and out at any given time, and we have to do it within 5 days. So yeah, a parent could, in theory, decide after listening to, and I hate to pick on Vern, but after listening to Vern talk, they could say, you know what, I'm not really comfortable with this, and because I'm not comfortable with this, I'm going to put my kid in ISP. And that is well within their rights. And then, of course, they can always say, you know what, I've been in here for 2 weeks. The risk isn't that great. I really want my kid to go back to school. 5 days later, our goal is to put that kid back at Vargas. If not, then, obviously we place them someplace at a different school. So that's sort of the way that the process works. But yes, we do suspect that as parents learn more about some of the strategies that we have, that they'll be making choices. What I will say though, and I know we had a meeting today, the biggest thing to take into account is number one, our kids are wearing masks with the exception of when they're eating. We still have pretty much everything is touchless at this point, from the soap dispensers to the paper towels to the faucets. Which also helps. Our HVAC system, Dr. Westover and her team did a great job, and Grace on West of making sure that the HVAC systems were overhauled. Obviously, there are some where we have to put them on the roofs, but even those are capable. It's all on the same EMS system, energy management system. We can flush the rooms beforehand. We're cleaning the rooms, right? So all these different protocols do create a safe environment for our kids. Probably the Achilles heel to any mitigation program is always going to be when people eat. And that's why, our goal is to try to get them outdoors as much as possible. But that is going to be the one logistical hurdle that we do have. But I know each principal can easily talk people through that whole process. Or each person, each family for that.
Each family, yeah. If there is a site where, well, let me imagine a worst case scenario. We have wildfire smoke and eating outside is not an option. Will we have students eat in their classrooms so they're sort of cohorted when they're taking off those masks to eat, or would we try to use an MUR during wildfire smoke?
Yep. So you'll see at the September, and Dr. Westover could probably make sure I understand which day is the correct day. But in one of the September meetings, I believe it's the first one, we actually will be doing two things. The first one is we'll be bringing back the beginning workings of a formalized fire season plan that identifies exactly what we are expecting to do, depending on where the air quality goes. And then the second part of that is obviously Dr. Westover will be bringing back one of the things, or initially that we looked at was the polar ionization. And when we put that one on hold, we also started looking at the UV systems that sort of exist and sort of working through there that help to mitigate the wildfire season. Obviously, the MERV 13 filters will help. And if they can filter out the coronavirus, then they definitely have the ability to filter out a particle matter of 2.5 or greater. And so we're not as worried about that, but we will be bringing back both of those items for the board to sort of weigh in on and give us guidance and direction on. Again, one, an additional filter possibly for wildfires, and then two, also a wildfire mitigation plan that takes this into account too.
Thank you very much. If there are no further questions from trustees, we will now move to public comment. If you're a member of the public and you would like to comment on this item, you can raise your hand in Zoom using the raise hand function or press *9 on your phone. I'm going to wait briefly to give people a chance to raise their hands. All right, we have 8 speakers. So each speaker will have 2 minutes to address the board. We'll get a timer up for 2 minutes, and we will start with Alvaro. Alvaro, you may unmute yourself, unless it's Kathy, and then Kathy, you may unmute yourself.
Yeah, no, it's Alvaro. Thanks. Just a quick comment. I mean, it was really there was a lot of information contained in the presentation, so it was a little hard to assess what was in there. Just a quick comment to urge you to revisit the safety protocols that may have been designed a month ago in light of Delta, because it's a new thing that we're facing. I mean, it's a lot more contagious, and some of the characteristics, for example, how quickly it shows symptoms, how quickly it can be passed on, have changed from what our original understanding of this virus was. And so that may affect some of these decisions and some of the timings, for example, of testing, et cetera. Another thing I wanted to say is I haven't heard any mention about the quality of the masks, except for somewhere it says that N95 masks were going to be provided to employees. But if I'm not mistaken, cloth masks are essentially ineffective right now against this virus. And if you're going to have a bunch of kids in the class with cloth masks, I'm not sure how effective that's going to be. And for reference, I'll say that medical grade masks are mandated in Europe, for example, in many contexts. For example, just to start at airports, but I think also in some schools. And that had something else, but I lost my train of thought, so I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. And as always, feel free to write the board as well if you don't get to finish your comment or if you think of something else. Our email as a group is trustees@mvwsd.org. Ms. Cooper, you may unmute yourself.
Hello, glad to be back. I have 2 detail questions and 1 comment. My first question is, how will the students get their food? Last year when we were in school, I'm at Graham, and they were bag lunches, they were crated up, and the kids didn't have to go through that cafeteria line, pushing and shoving, trying to get their food as fast as they can. I'm interested in how that will happen. Also, who will be doing the pool testing or any testing in the classrooms? Will that become another task that the classroom teachers and staff will have to do at the beginning of the day every day? Or will there be specific people going from room to room doing the testing? And then my last comment is that I hope that we can be sensitive to the non-vaccinated staff and students, because they all have their reasons why they are not vaccinated. It may not align with others, mine, and the majority of us. However, it is for a reason known to them. I just feel we need to be very sensitive to that. Children can be kind of cruel and pick on someone for the wrong reason. And that certainly adults can be insensitive. So I just hope that we are sensitive to that. Thank you very much for giving me your time.
Thank you, Ms. Cooper. Daniel Wang, you may unmute yourself. We'll get your timer reset.
Hi.
Hello.
Thank you for hosting this session. Full disclosure, my company worked on an antigen test for COVID-19. So I wanted to provide a little bit of guidance on when the team is going to do due diligence on selecting what type of test and with which vendors. So keep in mind that a lot of these antigen tests were granted EUA early on during the pandemic. The criteria were slightly different and not as stringent as it should be. So keep in mind, a lot of these antigen tests were designed to detect the COVID virus in symptomatic cases. So in the clinical trials, they specifically looked at patients that were symptomatic. So the sensitivity might be relatively high in those use cases, but for asymptomatic, maybe it might not catch a lot of cases. So it's great that in the pool testing, they're going with the PCR testing because that's still the gold standard. So just keep that in mind when you do your due diligence on which vendor you select, especially with which antigen tests they're using. And you can actually go to the FDA website to see what was the criteria during the EUA submission. And also another thing is, in terms of the air filtration, ionization is great, it works well, but it's not designed to be used when there are living occupants in that area, because ozone is a byproduct of ionization, which is a lung irritant. So just kind of keep that in mind. If there's wildfire, maybe the best thing to do would just have the children stay at home, because you're choosing a lesser of two evils, either respiratory irritation from smoke inhalation or COVID-19. Yeah, so that's my comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Daniel. And then our last speaker will be John Togasaki. You may unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you. So my question was about asymptomatic close contacts that have to quarantine. Is there any plan for them to continue instruction while they're quarantined, since they're not the ones who are symptomatic, and especially if they're asymptomatic through the whole quarantine, they're kind of put at a disadvantage. And so do they have an option of going into the remote learning, or are they just going to get assignments through their teachers and they have to do it independently? So has there been, or what's the thought that's been put to that? And the other thing is just, they can be losing easily up to a month with just 2 close contacts over the school year. So they can be losing a significant amount of time if there's not a good solution to that. Okay, that's my comment. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Trustees, comments? And we do have to give direction as well. Trustee Chang.
There's somebody else who wants to go first. That's fine too. I did notice I've been going first every time, but
yeah, fast on the draw, Trustee Chang.
Oh, very well. Okay. On the questions that are asked about the library field trips, music, and I'm very impressed with the safety protocols the district has planned for music and these other programs. I think that I would welcome seeing those happen at this moment. And I agree with the colleagues who said that the only exception being that I think overnight trips sound problematic. However, I think that if you're talking spring, or if you're talking overnight trips where everyone was just tested, I think there may be some wiggle room there, but I feel very confident what the district has planned with their intent of trying to restore these regular staples of a school experience and they've taken the proper safety protocols. Something for the, I think, interesting for our us colleagues to think about is I would urge us not to think about safety procedures on the board level based on time, but based on infection rates. I think this is our third rodeo, or for some. For us new trustees, this is the first time around, but we've now done 3 different cycles. This is our 3rd cycle of developing policy in a pandemic. And I think that the first 2 times around, we did it by time. We said, okay, here's the set policy that's going to happen from now through X number of months. And I think that this time around, I really think it would be great if we set policy based on, okay, this is what the safety protocol will be if this is the local infection rate. And if the local infection rate goes up, this is the escalation. And if it goes down, this is the de-escalation. And I think that would be a good one. The last big thing, I think I'm nervous that we haven't talked enough about masks and about providing students masks. Some of the parents are out talking about that in the comments about, I'm worried about this equity going on right now. Like on some of these online boards, you hear of parents with means of paying, like buying $15 mask. And I know plenty of families. Myself as a teacher, I couldn't buy a $15 mask on a regular basis for my child. Like, I think that there is this research now that, like vaccinated or not. So even if our middle schoolers in 7th, 8th grade are vaccinated, they could still be having the Delta variant, a viral load to spread. Like if we're gonna be spending money, maybe we should be not thinking of spending money on really sophisticated testing, but maybe we should be providing all our students masks the same way we provided students school supplies. I think a lot of medical settings, they protect their medical workers and their patients with masks and not by just testing. So I would really welcome us hearing more about what can we do to provide students and everybody the mask. I am nervous about antigen testing for the reasons that the people are saying, reliability. I'm also nervous about regular between getting more masks for kids, better masks, and then testing weekly. That's a big investment. It's also a big toll on the kids. If anyone who's done the weekly testing, you really have to do a deep nasal swab and to get a good result. And to do it weekly for a lot of kids actually could be pretty uncomfortable. I mean, I know it's safety, but I'm done on a weekly basis. I think we could get some pushback or at least some weak compliance that reduce the results of those tests. So I don't know. I guess I support what the district wants on providing those programs. I support the board on maybe holding up on the overnight. But I would welcome us as a board talking about, is there ways we can guarantee people get a mask and as an issue of equity? Thank you.
Trustee Chen, can I ask a clarifying question of you? So the talking about the deep swab for weekly testing, I know I have taken my son repeatedly into El Camino for PCR testing, and this would be PCR testing, and it was not a deep swab, and it was self-administered by him, and it wasn't uncomfortable. So I don't know if these are the same tests or not. And
well, even when you go to, I mean, I've done the. I've done that. I mean, I have had to go to. I've been teaching summer schools, and I've been going to the El Camino quite a few times this summer. Like they still supervise you how deep it goes, right? So it's like for small children, like there is a thing where they still have to. It's something that they have to do. I will say that as a teacher, we've been doing saliva testing in my school all year, and that's like the easiest. And I don't know if that's an option that a district will be able to pursue, but then there's nothing easier than spitting in a bottle. And that is it's been such an easy, and that's such an easy thing for kids to do. Baltimore School District did that starting in February of last year. So a weekly testing kids doing saliva testing. I know Los Altos was looking into it. I don't know if they had any traction with that, but then, I do worry that if we spend too much time thinking about testing, we forgo the simpler things, which is sanitation, social distancing, masking, which is what have kept most of our families and schools safe for the first 2 waves of the pandemic. And I think that if we double down on those, I think those would be tried and true.
Ms. Vicurine.
Yes, I just wanted to weigh in really quickly and say, I just want to make sure we understand that like we don't want to worry about financially either or. We want to make sure all children have masks, but we also want to do the testing in addition. The testing that we're investigating is actually free to the district. It's funded, through government funding. And so I don't want us to worry so much about the cost of the testing, but just the type of the testing that we want to really consider pursuing, as all of the safety measures working together, I think, are critical.
If I may respond to that, it's the attention cost. So not a financial cost. Now, I think that's often we worry about. I think sometimes we get too attracted to free things. Like I'm really interested in us paying money to get N95 quality masks to our kids. There are a lot of countries that are doing that. It's expensive, and there's an environmental cost to it. But at least until there's a vaccine out, I really think we should be providing families, especially there are families who can't afford. I mean, they're buying the cheapest mask they can get because it's such an expensive thing. Kids lose them. They shouldn't be reusing them. Certain masks, like I would welcome us spending money on masks instead of us spending our attention on free testing.
Dr. Rudolph, could you speak to masks?
I mean, it's board direction, so if that's where the board wants us to go, we can. I think there's going to be.
What do we already do? What did we do this past spring?
So we currently have masks for students who either come on campus who don't have them. So we have the surgical masks, we have K95s, we have the N95s, we have face shields. So we have a variety of masks. Obviously, we're buying masks for the music department and chorus. So we are providing those. If we want to go down the road of purchasing masks for all students, I mean, anything is technically possible. They won't be in on the first day, but it just depends. I think the consideration would be, the comfort of the mask and whether or not people will reuse them. Obviously, and I have to credit Shelley on this one, the air bands, which can be reused up to 50 times because you can wash those, or you can wash them 50 times. But then you come into the issue of so who's going to be the person responsible for washing them? I mean, there's a lot of different implications that come with it. But again, if the board if that's where the board wants to go, then that's the direction that we're looking for. The other thing I would say about testing, just as while the testing is free, there are, depending on which test you want us to use, there are different costs that are associated with it, right? And so obviously, if we're testing every week and we're doing a PCR test, there's an added cost that's going to be with that. But I think our mantra has been from the beginning to make sure that we do this in a safe and equitable manner. And so, if that's board direction, then we'll start tomorrow looking at various options that we can explore. And I just, on a personal anecdote, we gave every employee a mask at the beginning of the year with filters. I know board members got them too. Not everybody wears those masks. I tend to like them, but it just depends. It just depends, but it's not outside of the realm of possibility. It's just know we won't have it on day one.
And further clarifying question, my understanding of the masking policy last year and masking recommendations for schools, and I could definitely be wrong on this, was that wearing the mask wasn't protecting yourself. Wearing the mask is protecting those around you. And so by decreasing, there were lots of studies about the different layers that could be done in masks and the different filters and K95s and everything else. But even when the CDC made recommendations in schools, they didn't specify which type of mask, was my understanding. I know Delta is different. Has the CDC changed? I know they've said they want people to be masking in businesses and indoor settings again. Have they changed the recommendations about the type of mask yet?
They haven't changed the recommendation for the type of mask, but I think the consideration would be for those individuals who are 12 and up versus the younger kids. And that's also part of the reason why the emergency use authorization for Pfizer went down to 12, and I know Moderna and I don't think Johnson & Johnson's applied for it yet. I think that's also part of the reason why that's sort of where we are. So, I mean, if we're really thinking about who needs, the best mask, you're talking about older kids who need it. And then, there's also, what the CDC talks about is also the consideration of how those masks are worn. So for instance, me wearing an N95 isn't really feasible unless I cut off my facial hair. And because it's about the seal that's created. But, if you're going to prioritize which students, and it's not, I'm not trying to argue that younger kids are not going to get sick from the Delta variant and that they're not going to have an issue. I'm just simply saying if we're trying to prioritize the health and safety and we're thinking about who needs a cloth, more than a cloth mask to protect others, then it is you're looking for the adults whose respiratory system would be a lot more developed as opposed to the younger kids where you wouldn't see that. And you're right, Trustee Conley. It is about you preventing sort of the spread versus you protecting yourself from what's outside. And I know there were a lot of videos and that were done at night that sort of captured the dispersal of aerosols with masks, cloth masks, and everything else.
Other comments from trustees? Vice President Blakely.
I'm all for encouraging masks, but unless the guidance changes, I don't necessarily feel strongly that we should change our practice. I would like to make sure that we have them available. They'll break, kids forget them, whatever. So I want to make sure we have them, and I want to make sure kids are wearing them, and I want to make sure adults are wearing them. So I feel really strongly about masking, but not necessarily about investing in surgical quality masks for everybody unless the guidance changes. If the CDC or the state changes their guidance, of course, I think we'll need to react accordingly. I am very concerned about testing. I've had 3 different friends in the past week who've told me that their adult or teen children who were vaccinated months ago have come down with COVID. And one of them is a cameraman in LA, and he's been having to get tested every 2 days. And he thought, oh, it must have been wrong. And he got tested again. He's completely asymptomatic. His girlfriend now is really not feeling well. But 3 different cases in the last week is making me scared about just limiting our testing to unvaccinated people. I think we need to evaluate trying to get our vaccinated staff and employees tested as well. It may be not on the same frequency or cadence, but it's, with the Delta variant, a lot of them are asymptomatic and they can still spread it just as much from what I'm hearing. Initially they thought that if you were vaccinated, your viral load would be lower. But what I'm hearing in the New York Times and on NPR right now is that that's not necessarily true. You may not feel as sick, but you still may be pretty contagious to others. So I would like to insert some kind of testing of all employees, maybe again, not in the same frequency that we're looking at the unvaccinated employees, but I feel horrified for it. And I'm sure every teacher and staff person, in the district would feel horrified if they infected any kids and completely unwittingly, of course. So I'm glad we're doing 6-foot distancing for adults. So I think that will help. But I'd like to insert a little bit more testing for our adults, staff, and possibly also volunteers. We're allowing volunteers on. They may be traveling. That makes me a little anxious too. So I don't know if there's some way to get people tested once, that they have to show that they are negative once a trimester or something like that before they volunteer. But I think we have to pay attention to the vaccinated individuals as well, unfortunately for now. I like what you're doing about looking at the tests. Some of the tests may not be as sensitive as others, but I think just the fact that we're doing it is going to help. And so I would trust your and Tara and staff's judgment in terms of what's the best solution. And also, like some of my colleagues here have more experience in that regard. So I just like the fact that we are testing and that we're going to be investing in that. As far as the field trips go, especially if it were spring for the kids, the older kids that are vaccinated, you know, I don't think it would be as much of a problem there if they were vaccinated and tested. But it's good that we don't have to make that decision at this point in time. For the younger kids that aren't, you know, none of them can be vaccinated right now. And although I know they love Walden West and science camp, I agree with the comments that were cropping up during our question session. I think that that's just would be pretty foolhardy right now. And I imagine many parents would not feel comfortable. You can't wear your mask while you sleep. So if there's a way to push that off, I know you've got some scheduled in the spring. If there's a way to, you know, say we're not going to do them for the fall, but we'll keep the spring ones open-ended without having to give away our deposits, I'd be interested in deferring that decision. But if it's going to cost us money, if it's an all or nothing decision that we need to make now on the contract, I think I would recommend canceling those for this year. And during the school day field trips, we go on buses, right? It's not individual families driving. So that makes me a little bit anxious because it's harder to observe the 3-foot distancing. And I think the guidance said that they didn't have to, or the presentation said they didn't have to on school buses. Is that right? So I guess, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's correct. So there isn't social distancing guidelines for kids, but again, there is guidelines for adults.
So I'm a little, I mean, if kids are wearing masks, and obviously parents have to consent to field trips, and there's always some kids that don't go. I'm open to continuing to provide them and trusting that the parents would make the decisions for their kids, but I am a little anxious about that. We've also done walking field trips though, where you walk to a park or you walk to the library or something like that. And so I think those walking field trips would probably be just fine. You know, again, with masks and such. So those are my comments. Thank you.
Trustee Berman.
I think that Vice President Blakely really spoke to a lot of the same sentiments that I have. I think that testing is really important. I've heard, or I've been reading and listening to the research on people that are vaccinated, being asymptomatic and being infected. So I think that I do want us to take the time to test regularly and to also look at testing our staff that has been vaccinated in light of what we're learning about the Delta variant and the new variant that's creeping up. There are a lot of unknowns, and I think, you know, my top priority is, all of our top priority right now is to keep our kids in school and keep our kids open. So whatever we need to do to make sure that we manage, we, you know, put in all the right effort, all the effort that we can to make sure that we protect our students and ourselves. That would be my number one priority. And as far as testing, yes, I'm all for testing. Sounds like the PCR test is the gold standard. I want to make sure, you know, I want to emphasize, like when we come back from breaks, like coming back from the summer, just want to make sure that we get off on the right foot and that we can test our kids if we can and get those results back. And for the question about the field trips, similarly as Trustee Blakely, I feel like it's really difficult to monitor that the social distancing when they're on buses, when they're indoors. So I think for now, I think it would be, I feel like we should hold off on those field trips. I was also thinking about, you know, all the walking field trips that my kids did. And if there's a way to do those in a way that we can maintain all of those protocols, that would be ideal. So if there's a way to do that, I also know that would require parent volunteers. So those sound like they have the potential to be safe, but if we feel like we can't follow protocols on those trips either, then I think we should hold off. You know, this is sort of the last big stretch, and those vaccines, hopefully for our kids, are right around the corner. So hopefully in the spring, we'll be able to take our kids on more field trips. I know they've missed out. I know my rising fifth grader was really looking forward to some of those trips. But I think right now we have to do our best to keep our children safe.
Thank you, Trustee Berman. I will add, so on field trips, I am as concerned about where the children are going as how they're getting there. So for example, the walking field trips that we did in my son's class in previous years included going to Whole Foods. There's no way I would send a class of first graders into Whole Foods right now, right? So I'm probably like the conservative person on the board about this, but I think that we should hold off on field trips until later in the year. It's something we can always revisit. Definitely no overnight ones, but even our main job right now is keeping children safe, and that is going to be a challenge in the completely regulated environment of our schools, let alone trying to take children off campus into environments where we don't have control over what's going on. And I'm, that scares me, sending my child to school, to think about. And I know parents do have a decision about whether or not they let their child go on a field trip, but sometimes they get pressured in because all the other kids are going, and it can be a tricky thing. Regarding testing, I'm in favor of having the pooled testing on a weekly basis for all classrooms. I know in the presentation, I think it talked about like 10% of students. I don't think it needs to be permanent. I think it needs to be based on the prevalence of cases in our community. And we know that we're at a substantial case rate right now. Los Altos School District, I believe, is also doing weekly pooled testing. That's my understanding right now. And if we do that, I would like the pooled testing to be a PCR test rather than the rapid antigen. And I agree regarding even vaccinated adults need to be getting tested regularly right now. So having a regular cadence of testing for all of our staff and employees at our school sites, regardless, is important, but it may be that the vaccinated adults are getting tested once every 2 weeks versus if you're unvaccinated, you're getting tested. I think the federal government said twice a week, once a week.
Yeah, unvaccinated have to get tested a minimum once a week.
Once a week.
There's no exception to that.
Yeah. So maybe having a longer cadence for people who are vaccinated. They don't have to do it as frequently, but we do ask that they do it, once every 2 weeks or once a month or something like that, because we know that unfortunately, the breakthrough infections are very small, but they are happening, and then they do carry a viral load. Going to the issue of volunteers, I do, Vice President Blakely, you gave me some anxiety about that. Thinking about, a vaccinated adult who may be asymptomatic but is wearing a mask. They have a breakthrough infection, they're asymptomatic, they're wearing a mask, they come into my child's classroom. We would never even know if they had exposed the kids because we would have no metric on them. So I don't know if we want to encourage volunteers to get tested, or Dr. Rudolph, what do you?
I was going to say, as a board, you can make the determination that you don't want any volunteers until a later date, similar to what Trustee Chang was talking about. You can either put it as a time frame, or you can put it in terms of when we fall out of substantial and go to a lower tier based off of the CDC's guidelines. These are our recommendations of how we can incorporate people. But if the board is uncomfortable with having volunteers come in at the beginning of the school year, then there's nothing wrong with us limiting them. There'll be some upset parents, but I think people will understand that we're doing it as a safety protocol as opposed to going. So that was just us trying to figure out a way to balance it. We do have providers that will come in, and they have to adhere to being vaccinated. And obviously there'll be some schools that will ask about things like mentor connect and whether or not they can come in. But again, we can limit volunteers if that's the board's direction.
Could you remind me? It was much more clear cut. So nothing was clear cut last year, but in some ways it was more clear cut in that the state had set these different tiers that talked about the case rate. So if we're at 12 cases per 100,000 right now, what would be the cutoff point for a lower level in the tiers from the CDC?
So the problem is that I haven't spent much time understanding especially because they actually just changed it. I think just a couple of days ago or something like that, after there was some questions. So what we could do, we could come back with a better understanding of sort of how the CDC classifies it. And then we can come back with a recommendation on what that looks like for visitors. But again, I'm only saying this because I've heard a couple of you express some concerns about having volunteers come in. And so you can require for them to get tested as well as be vaccinated, or you can limit them until a later date and we can come back with some recommendations.
I'm wondering if other trustees agree that this might be something to come back to us at our first meeting in September with more clarification around the different levels from the CDC, and then we could peg it to, as Trustee Chang suggested, we could peg it to actually the prevalence, the COVID case prevalence in the community, as opposed to pegging it to how we feel on a given day.
In that grid where it says low transmission, moderate transmission, substantial transmission, and high transmission, and you said we were at orange substantial now, I'd feel comfortable saying moderate transmission yellow. I don't know exactly what those cutoffs are, but that I think that, and vaccinated and ideally tested, but I could, if with the mask and the vaccination at moderate, I'd feel more comfortable than when things are still escalating.
I agree with that. Trustee Chang.
I think that I agree with what Trustee Blakely and Professor Khan, what you're saying about us exploring this idea of having tiers and having interventions correspond with that. Regarding volunteers, I feel like there are certain settings in some school sites where if they are vaccinated and if they are joining our testing that we provide our teachers, I feel like they would be as safe to be with children as our teachers are. So like there are certain settings where we should, ideally, so it looks like most of our boards wanted to go ahead and offer testing. I think if we offer testing, then it should be a service that any volunteer should be able to enter that same system. I mean, I think it'd be really lovely if families could themselves volunteer to even get testing through the district, but I don't know if that's something we can do or will be funded. But I think that at least volunteers, I think we can get volunteers tested. Perhaps they can work on the same intervals as teachers. If not, then I definitely think we should tie it to infection rates. Just kind of circling back, I don't know if there's any takers on the board to want to explore this issue about the mask. When you look at the research on effectiveness of a cloth mask versus a Korean K95 mask, or they're pretty big. The margin is really wide. So it is alarming, I think, that if there are some kids who may have a very stylish mask that actually isn't really protecting them, versus there's some kids who parents buy them, the mask, they have the packs from Korea, and you see them at school. They open up the pack, it's a 98% effective mask, and they wear a new one each day. And then I think there's an equity thing here, because if we test, Brentwood opened up early already, and Brentwood, they already had infection rates. Some of you guys saw that in the newspaper. So if we just test, we're going to get infection rates similar to our community. So we're going to find out people are getting sick. But then what does that mean? We are not we're not cohorting. So I mean, just finding out people are getting sick is actually very destabilizing for our current model, because what does that mean? Because you send home every person who had a contact point beyond a certain number of minutes. That for a lot of classes in the middle school, that grows pretty quickly. But masks prevent people from getting sick. So El Camino Hospital, and some of you guys have noticed, El Camino, they don't let you wear your own mask in there now, right? So when you go to El Camino Hospital, they provide you a mask at the door because they recognize that the mask is the most important thing to keep them safe.
But they just give the surgical ones. They don't give out N95s. They give
but
out
the surgical, if you look at the studies, the surgical is so much more effective than the cloth masks that some of our kids are wearing too. When they're wearing those cute masks at Old Navy, like it's a cosmetic thing. Like it's like it's signaling, virtue signaling that they're compliant to the safety. But those cloth masks are not the same thing as. There's a reason why you can't wear a cloth mask to the hospital. And increasingly, a lot of airlines are really striking down. You can't wear gaiters on most airlines now and things. So I just think that there's a lot of research now we know about the quality of masks, and I think the CDC is just behind the curve on this. And I hope as a board we can get ahead of the CDC on this one.
Trustee Wheeler.
Yeah, I don't have anything more to add to this conversation, but I do have a question regarding the field trip question. Are we going to be, is our area going to be involved in inter-district sports? Because that's a place where kids would take buses to sporting events at different schools.
Yes, but as part of participation in the league, students have to be tested as well as the adults. I don't have the specifics of what the cadence of that testing is, but students will be tested as they compete.
And those are short bus trips, at least, right? They're not far away.
Right.
I don't understand the difference between a short or a long distance. It's the mixture. Kids.
It's the time that you're in the bus in the closed area. They talk about, like if you're in the bus for an hour in a closed space, it's much worse than if you're in the bus for 15 minutes. It's what the guidance says.
Trustee Berman and then Trustee Chang.
I just wanted to revisit the conversation about the volunteers. It sounds like we have some decisions to make around whether or not we're going to allow volunteers. And I'm not sure that we've landed on what that's going to be or the date or whatever level we're on. I wonder if we can just table that for the next meeting, or what kind of information do we need to have in front of us to make a decision about what that's going to look like? What's really challenging is, I don't want to make decisions based on how we're feeling today. I really want to look at what the data is telling us and what the science says and what the best thing is for our students too. And I know that our parents are eager to get back into classrooms and help. I know that it was briefly mentioned that maybe volunteers should get tested. I'm just starting to think about, well, who would that be? Would that be just the parent that comes in once a month, or is that the parent that is committed to be a volunteer every, the frequency of it? There's just so many things to sort of figure out in so many situations. I wonder if we can just hold off, school starts next week, and so where are we in sort of telling parents they can come in when we haven't really figured out the nitty gritty of what that's going to look like and what's the safest thing for our students. So I'm wondering if we, until we can have this conversation, if we just make sure we don't have parents in the classroom, right? Maybe when school starts.
And I know at Stevenson, the parent volunteers usually don't start until after the first 6 or 8 weeks of school.
Okay.
Anyways,
Right. And no parent will be able to volunteer until they've registered with the school district and provided proof of vaccination, and then goes through the fingerprinting and the background. And then this year we were going to issue a badge. So there was a lengthy process that was ahead of that beforehand. So no one would have been on campus on day one, but we can definitely, and I think there's a couple of issues that, sort of floating out there. So with this one, if you're fine, because we weren't going to be having volunteers on day one, and we're talking about during the school day. I know that some schools have some outdoor events like beautification that are not around students. That's a little bit different, and they plan on wearing masks. But if you're fine with it, we can bring back sort of something that's a little bit more tied to the possibility of risk, and that can also incorporate sort of if there are testing requirements. They would have to go to El Camino, which provides it for free. because they wouldn't be covered through our program. Only employees and students would be. But we can bring something back that has a lot more information to it if you want, just because we wouldn't have had it up and running as it stands right now. But I just want to make sure that that's the direction of the majority of the board, and we'll bring that back at a later date for volunteers.
Yes, and I just want to be clear, like I'm anxious to volunteer in my children's classroom as well. So I think for me, it's just, I want to make sure we have all the right information to say, yes, with confidence, we are confident in saying this is okay. So I just want to make sure that I'm clear on my position, that I would like there to be volunteers. I just want to make sure we're smart about it.
I think the fact that 4 weeks ago, I felt really comfortable with the idea versus now when our case rate has gone up so significantly, I'm less comfortable, means there's value in actually tying it to prevalence in the community. But I agree that we don't have the information quite yet, so it would be good to discuss. Trustee Chang.
Yeah, I think it's good for us to be talking about prevalence community. For volunteers, it may be interesting for us to, the next time we look at this issue, just tie it to whatever standard we're expecting of the teachers. So it looks like majority of us have this expectation that we expect the teachers to be tested regularly. So it's like, if that's what we expect of the teaching adults, then we hold the same whatever standard we develop for volunteers. And maybe that means the volunteers have to do it through El Camino instead of getting it at the school site, but maybe it sounds like from Dr. Rudolph, it could be built into their volunteer badge. On the field trips, Trustee Blakely said something that was really interesting about distance and the busing, and maybe instead of like banning field trips, maybe it's about miles, like trips, and maybe it can only be outdoor trips, right? Like I think that a short trip to Foothill Park or San Antonio is not a high risk, but could be really meaningful for and it can be really safe. Kids going outdoor hiking, naturalists, outdoor education. So like I think that maybe when we look at like our nervousness about field trips, maybe we can be specific about, we don't want kids in buses a long time, and outdoors different from indoor, and overnight is certainly more dangerous than a school day trip. And I didn't know if the district needed any more of our guidance on about what they're asking about the music and sports. Like, did our colleagues have thoughts, or does the district have what they need on that, or?
You all have a couple of items that you've tossed out and then you've left hanging. So if we could, to take it back to the 2000s, get rid of the hanging chads. I think we would be a little bit easier for us. So just want to make sure for volunteers that we're waiting until we come back with more information, with more direction, and sort of a more detailed thing. So I see, okay. The second one is that it's come out a couple times just about masks. I've only heard one person talk about this, about the district purchasing masks. We do have surgical masks that we give students. N95s, K95s are not recommended for young kids, but we do have the surgical masks if anybody needs them. But is there an interest from the board to look at the possibility of us purchasing masks or doing anything around there? Or is that?
So the thing that I am glad that we have surgical masks available for children if they need them. I'm wondering if, because we're talking about inequities as well, and also education around the effectiveness of different masks, if maybe we do a flyer home that says, here's some of the information about masks. If your child needs a mask at school, we have surgical masks available for them. Something to inform parents so they can make a good choice about that.
I think that the question here is really, are we in the business of providing masks, or are we not in the business of providing masks? If you five believe that we're in the business of providing masks, not just for kids who don't have them, but for kids who, have other needs, or for parents who just don't want to go out and purchase a mask, then we just need to know that so that we have that built into the budget, because it's not a cost that we've associated, because most people do have masks. And then from there, the publicizing and how we get through that outreach, that will come. But I think for us, just understanding, we do have some on hand, but if the expectation is for us to do outreach and provide masks, we just want to make sure that we know that.
Question, Dr. Groff. Do we currently enforce like kids not wearing gaiters or single ply mask? Like, is there any level of kind of enforcement on what level doesn't qualify as a mask?
California Department of Public Health says that they have to wear a minimum of cloth mask, as well as CDC. They don't. There's nothing about we don't like gaiters or anything like that. But again, I mean, that's, you know, if that's where the board wants to go with that, then, you know, we just need to be clear that that's the direction. But we've been pretty, we adhere, with the exception of asking kids to wear masks outdoors, just because we want to allow them to interact with their friends. We've been clear about the expectation that kids are wearing masks pretty much a full day. So, you know, we can definitely make sure that we include no gaiters into that. But if you want us to provide masks, I just want to make sure that we've captured that so our purchasing department can go out and start looking at that. And I do want to point out last year that the county as well as CDE did give us cloth masks, right? So it wasn't, they gave us cloth masks, they gave us some surgical masks, they gave KN95s, and then they gave N95s, but those were saved for our nurses. And obviously now those are reserved for the unvaccinated too, from any staff member in general, but particularly them.
Trustee Berman.
I like the idea of the informational flyer just to help give our parents information about masking and maybe, you know, what can be the most effective and what we may recommend. And also, could we provide, since we're talking about this being an equity issue, if after that we have families that, can we offer for families if, you know, if you have trouble accessing these, you know, a surgical mask and this is what you'd like for your child to use, please come and speak to our office, and, you know, happy to give them a box of masks that will work for their children. If it really is an equity issue and families need the masks, I wonder if we can provide them if they ask for them.
If that's the board's direction, you can. I think, you know, the thing I would say is I think we're at a point, just if this was last year and we were doing this, I think there's probably a greater need. We haven't turned anybody away from providing masks, and obviously because we're requiring it, we'll make sure that every school is stocked. There were some schools that hand out masks, almost like people were breathing the air, and they ran out pretty quick. And I think part of that's because in the beginning, you know, there was this debate about whether or not we need to have them, but I don't think there's any school site that will not provide someone with what they need. But if we start doing outreach for masks, you should expect an uptick on the individuals who are taking advantage of it, right? And it's just a cost that's going to be associated with it. But if that's the board's direction, then it's definitely something we can do. It's going to take some time to ramp up to get to that type of level. And I'm not arguing that it's not worthwhile. I'm just simply saying I just want to manage expectations that there will be an associated cost, and you know, it's just part of, we weren't there before, but we can.
I think people know about masks, and I think we should have them available, you know, as we have been. But I feel like the public is pretty aware of things at this point about the importance of masking. You can't like open a newspaper and not see it. I've never heard about the gaiters not being good. I just flew on Saturday and they didn't say anything about not wearing gaiters, and people were wearing gaiters and it was fine. I'm looking at the Mayo Clinic and the FDA right now, or the FDA website, and they talk about the better cloth masks have multiple layers. But I think, you know, any mask, as long as it's like covering the mouth and the nose, is going to be helpful in terms of transmitting it to other people. So I'm not in favor of doing a lot of PR around it. I think at this point, people know. That's my view.
I just land on, if somebody needs a mask, we get them a mask. I'm the stuff around gaiters, Trustee Blakely, I understand that it might not have been regulated. There has been stuff that shows they even like disperse it more effectively that rather than holding it in. So it sounds like that's already not our policy to accept gators anyways, so I think that's fine. But if a kid needs a mask, we get them a mask. And I think that's where we're landing.
I'm in support of that.
Okay. The second one is about third one is you talked about testing of staff, and and then the fourth one would be testing of students. So testing and staff, it sounds like you would like a more frequent cadence of testing all staff. And so if that's the case, I just want to make sure we can come back, we'll consult with, with the unions and talk with different stakeholders, and then come back with a recommendation on what that cadence will be. We won't have it up and running by day one, obviously, but we can make sure that we do that if that's acceptable to you.
And when we do that, when we move on to the question about testing of students, if we did pool testing, would the teachers swap go in with the kids on a pool test or no?
I'm sorry, repeat that.
If we did classroom pool testing, would the teachers swab go in with the kids?
We can pool test teachers separately, or we can pool test teachers as within that particular room. I think the preference, and Tara can jump in here, I think the preference would be to test them separately and then test kids as one particular group. But what we'll do is we can bring back a recommendation of what the testing regimen looks like and who will be tested and sort of which tests we will use. I think while yes, there is a possibility of getting a false positive using a rapid test or a PCR test or anything else, each one sort of has a benefit to some degree, especially if you're trying to find out if somebody appears to be asymptomatic and you're trying to make a quick decision about what comes next. It's possible that you use a rapid one, but it's also possible that you use the pool and you use a PCR. So we can come back with a approach for testing, and we can try to bring that back to the next board meeting. If not that one, which is next week, if not, definitely by the first board meeting in September.
Trustee Blakely and then Trustee Chang.
Just going to say, in terms of testing staff, it sounds like you may get some more information about what the different levels of high, substantial, moderate, and low are. I'd be comfortable easing up on whatever cadence we initially implement once we slip back down into the lower transmission levels.
Agreed. Trustee Chang.
I really like what Trustee Blakely said about testing intervals being tied to infection rates. I wonder what our colleagues think about testing everybody before school starts, even if it has to be a different method of testing than our regular program, because I recognize that what we do during the year may not be ready for schools about to start in days. But given that there's school districts around us who are reporting infections from day one, maybe I think as a board, maybe it'd be good for us to invest, even if it costs us money, let's just get everyone tested right off the bat so that we know where our points are. So, because otherwise it could be very, very disruptive if we open and then we test and then we are getting this rabbit hole of test of infections.
I mean, I would love if we could test the first week of school. I don't know how we would test everyone before school started logistically. And I don't know if we would, is it feasible, Dr. Rudolph, to given the demand right now, could we get pool testing the first week of school? Or the if the first week of school is 2 half days and a full day. So either then or immediately the week after. What's the soonest we could start that?
Tara, I know you've been talking about them because we've been running through this scenario.
Right, we've been working on it. I think testing companies are, like everyone, a little bit on overload right now, and so timing for getting all of our tests delivered might not get us testing the very first week of school, but we'll work on delivering testing materials as quickly as we can, and hopefully by the first full week we can get some testing materials in.
I would really encourage all parents, if they're able to take their child to be tested before school starts. El Camino does it for free. It's very easy to schedule online. Something that I am going to do with my 8-year-old, take him in and get him tested before because, you know, we haven't been at school all summer, and want to make sure he's not bringing anything with him.
The day today, the earliest El Camino appointments were Monday. So.
And then the last question is, it seems like there's an interest from the board to test students on a more frequent basis, regardless of, you know, not getting into which test is the best one to use, but I just want to, we can come back, especially after we talk with the testing agencies, to come up with sort of what this looks like. And we can bring that back also, but it sounds to me as if testing at minimum around holidays or times of travel is at least important, but if possible to test a lot more frequently than when somebody is presenting symptoms. Is that a fair assessment? And then we'll come back and with more detail. It's just a matter of figuring out what it looks like.
Trustee
I would say yes, but on the presentation, it's got students, and whenever we're in moderate, substantial, or high, it says offer screening testing for students who are not fully vaccinated at least once per week. So that's going to be all of our kids that are under 12. So once a week, I think, would be great.
All right, you got a majority there, Dr. Rudolph.
Okay. All right. And then just to confirm, field trips are put off until a later date. And until the level comes back, we can always revisit this at a later time. I just wanted to close that loop also.
Okay. All right. Thank you, trustees. Thank you, Dr. Rudolph. Is there anything further? Nope.
Nope.
All right. We will move on to item 5, which is future board meeting dates. August 12th, so next Thursday, is our first regularly scheduled board meeting. We'll also be back on September 9th and September 23rd. After those board meetings, there are usually community updates. Yes, Trustee Wheeler?
Yeah, I had asked before the meeting started, and so it's before the board meeting, a day before the board meeting. I think it's worth saying publicly about the August 11th rededication ceremony that we'll be doing.
I think it's August 14th, isn't it? August 11th is the all hands meeting, Trustee Wheeler?
Yes.
But
I thought the
in my event, I thought was later. Am I wrong, Dr. Rudolph?
Yeah, it is.
It's the
I think
14th.
they moved it from my schedule. Shelley or Megan or Arlene?
It's actually on the 19th.
The 19th. Okay.
Yes, back to school night.
What? It's the same night as back to school night?
At a different time, just the same day.
Okay.
Trustee Chang.
Thank you. A question about for members of the public who want to attend board meetings, is it for the foreseeable future they can continue the same process of online for them?
I actually was just about to ask that. So yes, we have the capability of doing online, but the one thing we haven't talked about, I mean, obviously the next board meeting is virtual just because the district office is still having some construction that's taking place. But you know, it's the next board meetings, and we can ask this if you want. There probably needs to be a discussion about whether or not we will have meetings in person or whether or not we will continue virtually. We will still have a virtual component. We can definitely do that. But whether or not you all want to meet and sort of what the implications of that is probably something that we should discuss at the next meeting, since it's not technically agendized here.
And how the public's role in in-person board meetings as well, if we do that. Okay. Well, and we need to schedule our board retreat. I almost feel like that might be a really good topic for our board retreat. We'll send out a doodle, assuming weekends, because that's when we usually do our retreat. And we'll send that around for everyone. All right, thank you. I know this was a weighty and substantive special meeting. Thank you everyone for being here on short notice. And thank you to Dr. Rudolph and all of our staff who not only worked so hard over the last year and a half, but then this summer got new guidelines midway through and a new variant and are still trying to figure things out as quickly and safely as possible. We really appreciate it all. And at 8:51, we'll adjourn this meeting of the Mountain View Wisdom School Board.
Okay.
Stay safe.